The man who did that in 1989, former Geelong captain and grand final player, Damian Bourke, good morning and welcome to The Pulse.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Rob.
No, it's very good. You're very kind to give up your time, and someone like you who's been there on the day, and that song seems to be part of our footy culture since, well, way back in the 70s. Were you a man who got inspired by music?
Well, it's funny you say that because I actually went out and bought that song the week of the 89 grand final.
There you go.
I had it playing in my car and whatnot. It's a ripper of a song, isn't it?
It is a ripper. Now, I want to take your memory back to 1989. You did remember yesterday coming into the studios of 94.7 The Pulse to have a bit of a chat that year to a young fella named Grant Bench. He's sitting beside me today and he's tickled pink to revisit that.
It sure is great to talk to you again, Damian, and I know I admired you back then and we still do today, and I think we all want to talk about the 89 grand final, don't we?
Well, maybe not. I reckon you're probably sick of talking about it, are you, Berkey?
Well, I just wish we had won it. I would be happy to talk about it. But look, as everyone says, it was a great game. It's still remembered today as being one of the old school, old style, hard fought, physical game.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask about, Damian, was the expectation on Geelong that year. We haven't won a flag for quite a while. Did the boys feel that?
Well, I think they did. It was the club was just on that sort of verge of change. We had some pretty horrible years, and probably underperformed as a team and even potentially as a club. I think it was almost about that time when the whole club changed its approach and the culture improved, and it was all about the character of people within the club, not just the team but the whole club, and it sort of paid dividends over the next decade. And then you saw the great success pardon me, they had in the early 2000s, and the club's just gone from strength to strength over that period of 20 to 25 years. I do feel it sort of started to change back then in the late 80s.
Your personal situation, Damien, it seems that every year someone battles through to be fit to play in the grand final. Is always the risk that match committees make about we need this bloke in, we're prepared to play him slightly underdone. And it's a story that pops up. Geelong was certainly assisted in 2011 when Collingwood went in with a couple that weren't quite right. In hindsight, that particular time, tough decision for you and the match committee yourself to play that day?
I thought you were going to ask me to play today.
There was a spot at ruck for Brisbane. So.
Well, you look fit enough that you could still play, but there might be a few other ailments that would prevent that.
The salary cap might prevent me. Look, it was, you should never ask a player if they are okay to play, particularly during the final series, because the answer is going to be yes. And it's as if Jesus does his rounds every Thursday night and performs miracles.
Yes.
Look, I was struggling. I know after the Melbourne game, was it the preliminary final? Or one of the finals. Yeah, I really could barely stand up. Legs were that bad. At the time, I felt like I was okay. I did my ankle in the first quarter, which was unfortunate. I think too, with those really big games, and lots of guys have been through it, you can kind of overlook an injury. So unless it is truly debilitating that you really cannot move something, I think you can sort of put it out of your mind and push through it. There's plenty of times, I don't know, with plenty of guys that have got through a game, played okay, but when you cool down after the game, you go, oh my goodness, you were so sore, or your ankle's so swollen, you wonder how you got through it.
You see, Brisbane have got Lachie Neale, who's had this foot problem for quite a few weeks, but seems to be able to play. But on the other side, Callum Mills didn't get in for the hamstring. Do you think it's time that we had a week off before the grand final to let all these things settle?
No, it's part of the attrition, Grant.
I don't like it myself, but I think that's the way they're heading. The pre-finals bye is not my kind of thing either.
Yeah, what do you reckon, Berkey? A week off to get Cherry ripe?
I tend to not agree with that because I feel that when you're playing, you do want to keep going. I feel like, for me, if I had that week off, it would sort of take away a bit of that energy in the build-up. So I do like that aspect of it. Yet when you're feeling good, you keep going. I appreciate, you want all the players to be there and you want the best performance. But I do tend to agree it's part of that attrition. That's why it's so damned hard to win a premiership.
1989 was interesting because you were replaced when you come off injured with Darren Flanagan, who probably played his best game for the club that day. So it wasn't as if Geelong were decimated necessarily in the ruck because of your departure. But we noticed last week in the game when Oscar McInerney went off the ground for Brisbane, and many think, oh, well, that's going to cause some problems. But it actually seems to improve their function when they took one tall out of the forward line, put an extra small in. They seem to function better. So tactically, these things can sometimes work to your advantage, not necessarily a disadvantage.
No, that's very true. That's very true. I think what you saw last weekend too is a different role of ruckman these days as well. I know a lot of coaches probably don't value the ruck position as much as they used to in the past, and a lot of ruckmen don't have that clean disposal. So last weekend you saw it, each time Geelong got it out of the centre, cleanly out of the centre, we were dangerous, really dangerous. As I tend to sort of value a good quality ruckman, ruck-rover combination is just invaluable. But you're right, you get sometimes the force changes in a team can have fantastic consequences. Mind you, sometimes you can go back to the opposite to you.
Yeah, and what was interesting, and I'm not being disrespectful to Reece Stanley because I love him and I've mentioned it on this show many times. He's done a marvellous job, but he's not a natural, genuine ruckman. So the expectation that with McInerney going off, he would dominate the position was ridiculous. Had it have been Max Gawn, then he probably would have dominated. But Reece is a tall ruck rover more than a ruckman, so he wasn't necessarily able to take complete advantage of McInerney's departure.
No, that's true. But he's also a bit of a changing style of ruckman. So a lot of times these days you'll see that style of, as you'd call it, almost a ruck rover style in the ruck. I don't know. I still like the old school strong hard ruckman that can do more than just contest the hit outs. To have a presence on the ground. Protecting smaller guys and making sure they can get clearance out of the centres. I think it's invaluable.
Your time in Brisbane playing with the Bears, does that give you an obvious lean to today's game?
Look, I'm backing the Lions today. I was also on the coaching panel during the premiership years. A good mate of mine is a club doctor, Paul McConnell. So I'm certainly backing him. And after watching them last week, I was at the game last week, the way that they just kept going for the full quarters was quite impressive. I felt that both Geelong and Brisbane played a very similar style of football, and I do feel that either team could have won it on the night. There was no one side dominating. But the way Brisbane just kept going, because I thought they would have dropped off at half time and they didn't. They kept it going. I just feel that's probably what's going to get them over the line today. It should be a tight game, but I just feel they're going to get over the line.
Can I just put my one-eyed Geelong scarf back on for a sec, Rob? How do you think Geelong went this year overall, though, Damian? I was pretty happy with the year overall, albeit disappointed last week.
No, I was too. I was disappointed. At half time, I actually thought they had it, and I was quite confident to start of the second half. But we had a couple of games and a couple of quarters throughout the season. You go, we played beneath our standard. There might have been some reasons in regards to injuries or one or two key players just being out of form. But I tend to agree. I think overall it's been a very good year. If you said at the start of the year that you're going to have some ups and downs finishing a preliminary final, a good contested preliminary final, you'd have to say, I'm satisfied with that. So I think overall they've had a good year.
Last week's game was a snapshot of our year. I mean, that second quarter was some of the best we've played, and then the third quarter was some of the worst quarter football we played.
Yeah. And that happened a few times throughout the year, and that's the type of thing that costs you dearly at the end of the season. You can let yourself down once or twice in a game, one or two quarters, and it can cost you significantly at the end of the season. But
and one more on Geelong, Rob, if I may. Toby Conway, what do you think of his future at the Cats?
Mate, I think he's terrific. I think he's a long-term prospect for them. He's a good investment. He's had a couple of smaller injuries holding him back. And he's a good-looking rooster. There's a few people say he looks a bit like myself.
Yeah, there was a wonderful comment made at a footy presentation night that I recently attended, and the local football legend got up and we was talking about one of the players. He said, he's the man everyone wants to look like and every woman wants to be with. It's he's very much that young fella. So I think he's got an assured future at the Cattery.
Yeah, and a really good fella.
Yeah. Interesting, just on that theme, it's nowhere near where I wanted to go, but we might as well tack it up. Many thinking that Geelong are heavily chasing Sean Darcy to come back home, a local Western District boy, played at the Geelong Falcons, chasing a ready-to-go ruckman to assist the development. There's already a couple of young ruckmen on the list, 19, 20-year-olds. Do you think Conway should be left to develop into this side now with Stanley supporting him for one more year, or would chasing Darcy be a good thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the key to it is to don't just recruit a specialist ruckman, if that makes sense. So that the players today, and even Toby, I think you'll probably find they'll develop him to be more than just playing the ruck, and that's probably the key to a club having more than one tall. Because he's a good player.
Yeah, I don't. The problem is if they're chasing a couple of midfielders, which it looks like they are. I don't know what resources they've got to trade left. They've you look at their list. I don't see that there's any tradables. You certainly wouldn't be wanting to give away your gold line players. Draft picks for a club that's continually finished so high that is going to be limited. So their resources to bring more in are probably getting a bit thin.
They seem to do it well, though. It is their recruiting and the way they list management. So I do have a lot of confidence in the club's ability to almost create players that they need rather than just draft someone that they're hoping will make a position like that. When Cameron Ling yesterday, when he was drafted, he was originally sort of playing in the forward line. It's just that Stephen Wells saw him play a game midfield and he did all right. He thought, maybe there's more than one sort of angle with this kid.
Yeah, well, that's one of the greatest turnarounds of all time. A full forward into one of the hardest running midfield taggers in the history of the game is an extraordinary story in itself. But there's many like it in the game. So, Damian, the grand final, the memories, the day we talked about the song and the excitement and the build-up. Let's just talk about what's it like for a young player with this hype that's happening. It's even more so now than when you did it, 35 years ago. But what is it like?
You become a little bit oblivious to it. I know the week build-up is very big, and to be honest, we were almost exhausted by the time the game came around because there was so much on. Starting with the Brownlow on the Monday night, Couchy won the Brownlow, rest in peace, Couchy.
Yes.
Right through to the Friday parade, so you're sort of doing something all the time. But as Malcolm Boy used to say at the time, we've just got, it's part of the whole thing. It's not just a game, it's part of it. So, okay, so we took it all in. But the funny thing is, on match day, we didn't notice it. The only time we sort of felt the roar of the crowd was when we ran out. And then after that, we're almost oblivious to it. And I know there's a lot happening in the start in the first quarter there. But people have said to me, they describe different things and the noise, and I'm going, I couldn't even remember hearing the crowd once the game started. And obviously when you've got the best part of 100,000 people either cheering or booing you, it's pretty significant for those in the crowd. But you do become sort of hyper-focused. And it's probably not until the end of the game then that you realise sort of appreciate the scale of the crowd.
And then having said that, there's the perceived pressure, I suppose, particularly in young players, and some of them rise to it and produce their absolute best. And we'll go back to when I was saying before about Darren Flanagan being able to go on and play the game he played. But there's also lots of stories of really good players that haven't been able to absorb the pressure and deal with the day, because as much as you try and say it's the same as a home and away game, it clearly isn't. And there's different expectations, and I guess most of them are what you put on yourself. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it's funny you describe that, because that has happened quite often when some absolute stars have underperformed in those big games, but played well in other big games. So I don't know what's behind that. Pressure on yourself for sure. I think a lot of guys put a lot of pressure on themselves, and I think the bigger a player you are, and I look at Patrick Dangerfield in this sort of situation, he's probably had a lot of pressure on him to perform at his best, because he is fantastic at his best, when his role within the team sometimes doesn't need that to help the team to win, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It needs him to play a particular role. He plays it. He does that really well. He may not be the standout star getting the 3 votes every week, but the team wins. And that's what it's all about. We played in the grand final where Gary had to kick 9, I think it was, and we lost. That's a fantastic effort to kick 9 goals, but the objective is for the team to win.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Any extra expectations on you being the captain that day, Damian?
There would have been... especially, I think what happened closer to the game day was the history of the club, and it's been so long since we'd won a premiership, and that was like a ghost in the background, something that was broken or killed and put in the cupboard. It wasn't until years later when they were able to sort of break that premiership drought that everyone's probably felt a lot better about the club. And as you've seen, the number of premierships since the club's very, very held in very high regard.
Damien, I had the privilege of being at a function in the early Bomber Thompson, and he was talking about the club's history, and he thought there was an unusual disconnect between the past players and the club when he arrived, and he did spend a bit of time changing that. With the work that Bob Gartland and others have done, it seems to me that the Geelong Footy Club is a really comfortable place for you and those of your era and other eras to walk back in and feel as though you're still part of it. Is that the way you feel now, or is there still a little bit of a disconnect?
No, you're right, and I think there was a disconnect years ago. I'm actually on the committee of the Past Players Association, and you're dead right. It's not just the past players, but the whole club welcomes past players and the history of the club, because they've all contributed to the fabric that makes up the Geelong Football Club for 160 odd years. And it's quite an amazing history, really, to go back that far. So the welcoming of past players and the appreciation of them is wonderful from the club now, and well supported by Steve Hocking, who's the CEO, of course.
And on that theme today, the media making it out to be South Melbourne versus Fitzroy, there certainly seem to be cases, and I think Bob Skilton and Kevin Murray are the two icons that have said that this is still my club, this is the club I played for, and I'm still very much attached to it. But there seems to be other cases where some players from that era are probably a bit disgruntled with the move and lost contact with the club. It must be a little bit difficult for some South Melbourne people to attach to Sydney, but most seem to be doing it pretty well.
I totally agree with that. I think when Brisbane merged supposedly with Fitzroy, it was more like a takeover. So I could totally understand a lot of Fitzroy people would have felt very dislodged and probably lost without a team to a certain extent, because then Brisbane was the dominant name and brand. I think what certainly helped that, though, is Brisbane coming through with premierships and still embracing the history of Fitzroy. So I think that was a great way for those older Fitzroy types to be part of that success and enjoy it and leave a drop it. And I guess the same with Sydney. I remember when Sydney moved to, when South Melbourne moved to Sydney, it was pretty radical actually at the time. So.
Yeah, it wasn't done very well really, and there was a bit of disconnect. But I think that both clubs have done a good job of trying to connect to Melbourne. They wear the old jumpers at times, and I know Fitzroy in particular do a lot of really good relationship with the supporters down here when they come down for home games, and they wear that old Fitzroy jumper when they play locally, and I think that shows that they're really keen to keep the history, because both clubs have got an extraordinarily long history, and the great players that played with both clubs, that it'd be a tragedy if they were forgotten with no home to have. So today, for me, is definitely a South Melbourne versus Fitzroy type of feel.
I had a joke with Ken Gannon years ago when Geelong was struggling and Footscray was struggling. I said, well, Ken, why don't you go to Footscray and offer for them to take over the Geelong Football Club? 100% let them take over the Geelong Football Club. I said, you've got to be kidding. I said, yes, just on two conditions. We want to keep our name and keep our colours. Bad, isn't it? You want to see your team out there? That's your tribe. You want the name and the colours. That's what it's all about.
Can I ask you quickly, Damien, when you went to Brisbane, what was it like in those early days of the Brisbane Bears?
Look, had they still been on the coast, I wouldn't have gone. But the fact that they moved to Brisbane and moved to a club structure, they were probably... It was almost like starting from scratch, to be honest. So they were new to the Gabba. They still were under-resourced. They still had a squad that probably wasn't as strong as that they would have been had they been like a Victorian-based club. But I think that was the start. And I only had sort of the 2.5 years there, but I think that was at least the start of them being able to build to the position that they got to, which was when Lee came along and coached them to premierships. Yeah,
within 7 or 8 years, they won 3 flags in a row. So obviously the foundations that you saw were right.
Yeah, and I just feel like it wouldn't have happened if they stayed on the Gold Coast.
And the fact that you remained involved in the club when your playing days finished as a coach assisting, and that you were obviously taken up by that change.
Yeah, I had a couple of years away from the game, basically. I think a year after I retired, I didn't even watch a game or anything. Then I just bumped into Lee Matthews socially, actually, up at Brisbane at a friend's 40th birthday party. She's passed away since. And he just said, would you like to get involved? I said, oh, yeah, I'd be interested. So I went and had a chat with him and came on board. And I think I did about 6 or 7 years with them. That was a pretty exciting period too. They had a fantastic team. played exciting football. And a really interesting part about it, the style of football they played during those early 2000s is the style that Geelong under Bomber Thompson pretty much played, that then got them to 2007 and beyond.
Yeah, I do remember watching Brisbane at the height of their powers at Cardinia Park one day. There was a day that Darren Milburn thought he was going to tackle Michael Voss and got completely splattered, and it was a good indication of the difference between the two sides, but it was almost as if they said, righto boys, this is the blueprint, this is what we need to be, and Bomber led them to that, and it's been pretty good being a supporter ever since.
Yeah, no, really great. That's why I say the whole club's been very good.
I want to touch on Lee Matthews. You've been up close and personal with him at a time where he was, well, many in Geelong still regard him as the devil. I think he's the greatest single influence on the game in my time. I had the privilege of chatting to him on this station some time ago, and he's got this aura about him, even watching him on television now and certainly remembering as a player. Does he have that with you? Did you feel that there was this aura in this man that just captivated those around him?
I say yes in the first instance because, he's a player of the century and he's done it all when he started at Brisbane. I didn't really know him before he started at Brisbane. I played against him but couldn't say we were mates or anything. But so he certainly had that aura. But as you get to know him, he's just a normal sort of guy. He lived around the corner from us. I'd grab coffee with him and Katie and his wife and catch up. But the really interesting part about him, what I saw him at Brisbane, was he had the ability to bring everybody onto the same page. The whole team, the whole coaching crew, the whole football department, pretty much the whole club. He was able to bring them all onto the one page. And that's a pretty powerful thing. When you're all on the one page going in the one direction, it's like this machine just forges forward, and that's exactly what you saw with the results on the field. So he was very good at that. He was probably, I feel his strength was his strength more than being a tactical coach. That's probably often where the assistant coaches need to come in and provide ideas for the coach to implement. But he was just very good at getting the whole club on the one page, moving forward. And as you saw with those premiership years, it was almost like the unstoppable train. I think that was one of the differences when Vossi then took over the coaching role. They sort of slotted him into the same type of position, but he's a rookie coach. So all of a sudden you had this guy, Lee had already coached premiership and 10 years experience or whatever it was. Vossi came in and didn't have that experience, but was thrown in with the same expectation. I just think it was a bit too much for him. And as you saw, he then sort of stepped back, and now he's come back to be quite a successful coach. So what he's done at Carlton this year.
Yeah, I had a chat to David Parkin, who was involved in Voss at both ends, and thought that he didn't have the ability to delegate early in his days, and he certainly learnt to do that. And that's interesting you talk about Lee Matthews, because I guess Malcolm Blight was one who had complete control of the environment, where Lee Matthews, like Parkin and others, was one of those that started to delegate responsibility to those to do things that he knew he didn't need to then worry about, and that probably took a lot of pressure off, well, him individually, but also the playing group.
It's quite amazing the number of resources that they have too. So during those premiership years with Brisbane, they had virtually a full-time sports psych in Phil Jauncey. They had the trainers, the medicos, the physios. A lot of them were so much full-time. You had all these assistant coaches. Lee would have had me there full-time if I could have. I was part-time. I was sort of working as well. And after a few years, I remember I did a couple of years down Geelong with Bomber Thompson. I was doing the ruck coaching down here for a couple of seasons when they finished the preliminary final to Brisbane, actually, the fourth crack at the grand final for Brisbane. But I remember talking to Bomber about it, and I said, look, I can't pinpoint what it is, but I reckon Brisbane had probably 1 to 2 full-time equivalents more in their coaching support group than Geelong. I know it costs money to have lots of staff, but it's amazing what a difference having all of that support around you. You did right, the ability to delegate things, or just as importantly, the ability that the head coach doesn't have to worry about these things. Centres Lee used to talk about. You had guys like Craig Starcevich, who was running the training PE program, and he got down to the level of detail of checking what height the aeroplane was flying at for its altitude to make sure the players weren't tired, or rehydrating to the nth degree on the plane, and all of that comes about because they had more resources. If you think back in the 80s, Malcolm Blight, when he first started, he was working and coaching part-time, let alone the ability to have, what they call it, the soft cap now or something, staff that they're allowed to have in their coaching staff.
Damien, you're barracking for Brisbane today, but can they win?
Look, I feel they can. I know Sydney have had a cracker of a season, but I don't think it's going to be the flashy things that are going to win. They've got a couple of young fellas here to put on a bit of a show last week, but I just think it's that hard work you're going to see. And Fagan seems to have got them, working hard for 4 quarters, and that's what I think is going to get them over the line. I think they'll just keep going, and I think it'll be close, but I just feel they're probably going to run over the top of them by the end of the fourth quarter.
It doesn't often happen that the previous 2 defeated teams in the grand finals are playing this year, so both have got their redemption part as well. So it's going to be interesting how that affects the game.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm a big John Longmire fan. I think his role to get Sydney or remain relevant for so long is an extraordinary story, as Geelong's has been, Sydney no less. And both coaches deserve it, both playing groups deserve it, and I don't know what, I still haven't made my mind up, but it's going to be a great game. Berkey, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. You've went for a bit longer than I expected, but
That's okay.
Open, honest, and very enjoyable chat. Look forward to catching up with you soon.
I'm looking forward to watching the game. Hope it's a good one.
Good on you, mate. All the best.
Thanks for your time.